Good morning and welcome to today's discussion hosted by the CRTG working group about right-wing extremism tackling the exploitation of children and youth. My name is Cecilia Polizzi and I'm the executive director at CRTG working group, an independent
welcome to today's
non-profit
discussion hosted by
organization.
the CRTG.
An independent and non-profit organization dedicated to protect the rights and well-being of child victims of terrorist use and exploitation, and that works to equip policymakers, professionals, and practitioners with the tools necessary to understand and respond to violence against children in terrorism. Thank you for joining us for this discussion. The threat from right-wing terrorism in the United States and Europe is rising. While this is not a new phenomenon, its current manifestation and scale heighten a sense of insecurity, alarmism, and the urgency of designing and implementing comprehensive policy responses that effectively curb its growing frequency and lethality. Right-wing terrorism, also referred to as far-right or racially and ethnically motivated terrorism, is not a coherent movement, but rather a shifting, complex, and overlapping milieu of individuals and groups espousing narratives and ideologies compounded by hatred, racism, xenophobia, Islamophobia, or anti-Semitism. In the past few years, right-wing extremists carried out multiple large-scale terrorist attacks, as we have seen in Christchurch, El Paso, Halle, Hanau, Charlottesville, and the most recent attack against the United States Capitol. In the pursuit of politically motivated aims, right-wing extremists, drawing on international networks, ideas, and personalities, continue to mobilize others and demonstrate an exceptional capacity to spread the propaganda, magnify their message, and ultimately outreach and recruit youth. The demography of supporters of white supremacist, national socialist, neo-Nazi, and other related groups embracing similar ideologies is increasingly younger and increasingly violent. How widespread and embedded are far-right ideologies and organizations among youth? How have right-wing extremist, populist parties and movements been able to attract young recruits? With what strategy and with what rationale? What are the risk factors at the basis of their continuing attraction, and what consequences youth participation in extremist activities impose on larger communities and society? Before introducing our distinguished panelists, a few words in terms of the format. The session is recorded and live streamed on YouTube, and it will be further disseminated after the event. And we look also forward to an engaging Q&A session. To ask a question, please use the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. We will allow time for our keynote speakers to address questions at the end and urge you to send them throughout the discussion. Our speakers will discuss and share their observation and insights on childhood and adolescent risk factors that increase the vulnerability to right-wing extremism, strategies the right-wing extremist families employ to pass on their belief to their children, peer-based recruitment, neo-Nazi and accelerationist recruitment of youth, terrorist ideologies and propaganda, and what opportunities they see to enact effective responses and mitigation efforts to these challenges. We will open the conversation by hearing from Dr. Simi, Professor of Sociology at Chapman University, followed by Dr. Bethan Johnson, Doctoral Fellow at the Center for Analysis of the Radical Right, Henry Kopel, a federal prosecutor at the United States Department of Justice, and Daryl Johnson, owner of DT Analytics. Without any further delay, I will turn to our first speaker, Simi, who is an associate professor in the Department of Sociology at Chapman University and a member of the Executive Committee for the National Counterterrorism, Innovation, Technology, and Education Center at the University of Nebraska. For the past 25 years, Pete has been studying political violence, hate, and extremism. His fieldwork has taken him inside the white supremacist groups across the United States, where he has been embedded with racist skinheads, Klan members, neo-Nazi, and anti-government militias. He is also co-author of the book American Swastika, Inside the White Power Movement Seeds and Spaces of Hate. Pete, thank you very much for being with us today. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it. I just want to start with just a few words, provide a little bit of context for my comments in terms of the methodology. Our approach has been to use three basic kind of data sources. We've been following the presence of right-wing extremism in the cyber realm since 1996, which has allowed us to see some interesting changes, especially in terms of the technology, the different types of platforms that have emerged since that time, and so how their use has changed along with those changes in technology. The second major type that you just mentioned is the ethnographic field work that's allowed for some direct observation of active members. And I'll talk a little bit specifically about some of the parenting strategies that I saw utilized by active members. And then third, where I want to start is what we found with some very extensive life history interviews that we've been able to do with over 100 former white supremacists that have allowed us to provide some or allowed us to gather some details about childhood and adolescent experiences. And so I want to start there. And this gives us some degree of insight, at least for this sample, in terms of some of the risk factors that we found during their childhood and adolescent upbringing. In general, we found very high levels of traditional family and individual level adversities. And we've calculated these levels using what's called the Adverse Childhood Experiences, or ACEs checklist. Basically, what we're looking at here are high levels of physical abuse. And again, this is reported from the participants themselves, but high levels of physical abuse, sexual abuse, parental neglect, substance abuse in the families. These types of adversities within their kind of family upbringing are very prominent. They're the sample that we've collected with former white supremacists in terms of the results in this area are comparable to what you would find with samples of conventional street gang members or incarcerated offenders, with one very important exception. We do not find any clear patterns in terms of socioeconomic status, in terms of their backgrounds. In other words, they kind of come from a wide cross section in terms of their socioeconomic status, their family socioeconomic status. We have participants in the sample from very wealthy backgrounds, and that runs the full gambit. So in terms of intergenerational poverty, which you often find concentrations when you look at samples of conventional street gang members or incarcerated offenders. This is an important difference for our sample of former white supremacists. Now, I want to move then into what we found in terms of the ethnographic fieldwork and what it told us about the parental practices. And I should say, with the sample of formers, most of those individuals were not raised by family members who were involved in right-wing extremist groups. They came to it in their adolescence, but they were raised in families where there was more informal types of socialization that was consistent with the beliefs that they later encounter in adolescence or adulthood. So informal types of more what you might call ordinary or everyday racism, racist jokes, the use of certain kinds of slurs within the family. Those were pretty prominent in the life history interviews. But again, their relatives weren't necessarily members or adherents of these types of groups. Whereas with the ethnographic field work with active members, obviously these individuals were actively involved in groups, and a portion of them were parents. And that allowed the opportunity to actually observe how they raised their children. It was probably one of the most difficult aspects of doing field work with active members, is to see some of the practices they use for children. So I observed children as young as 5 doing Nazi salutes already, small children being dressed in Klan regalia, Nazi t-shirts, Nazi uniforms, the full gambit there in terms of really trying to socialize their children in the direction that they want them to go, beginning very early. And of course, from their perspective, the parents see themselves as political activists, and so they see it as very important to transmit this to their children. So it's a form of political activism, really. Just having children is a form of political activism, because it's helping save the white race. And so it becomes very important for them from their perspective to try and pass this on to their kids. But they also recognize that sometimes when you push your children in a particular direction, they go the opposite way. And of course, their worst fear is their child growing up to support multiculturalism and become what they call a race traitor or a race mixer. So some of the parents use much more subtle approaches, what you might call a soft sell approach. And in that respect, they'll kind of cloak the hatred in an emphasis on passing on kind of a reverence for heritage and kinship and loving your people, these kinds of things. But again, it's all with the premise that hopefully they're going to be able to pass on a very kind of extreme white supremacist ideology to their children. And then third, I just want to talk about what we've seen in terms of the kind of peer-to-peer recruitment strategies. Of course, earlier on in the 80s and 90s, much of this was happening offline with non-digital environments, oftentimes at places like music shows, and the offline aspects remains important, but obviously now with the digital landscapes, a lot of the peer-to-peer recruitment is happening online. And so we're seeing various types of spaces, such as gaming platforms where recruitment is prominent, the use of different types of social media platforms, from mainstream ones like Twitter and Facebook to much more secretive ones like Telegram that are encrypted and so forth. And one of the things that seems to happen is that youth who may have some interests or sympathies towards something like fascism or Nazism, they're able to find others with similar interests and essentially kind of radicalize each other. And a lot of this is happening, in anonymous environments. So there's that aspect to it. And of course, it's readily accessible. And that's been one of the, I think, changes to see over the last 25 years, is that, in the mid 90s, there was lots of these websites, but now, with social media platforms, with gaming platforms, with sharing platforms, there's just so much more accessibility. And now we see youth really being drawn in. It's much easy for them to be drawn in. And a lot of the online kind of hate culture, if you want to call it that, it is based in a kind of the use of humor. And so there's, jokes about the Holocaust. There's jokes about the history of lynchings in the United States, for example. And so they're being exposed to this hateful ideology, but under the banner of humor and jokes. And then, of course, that can escalate over time as they become more and more immersed in these networks.
Thank you so much, Peter. And I think that our next speaker, Dr. Bethan Johnson, will further articulate on these dynamics, trends, manifestations, and on the particular strategies and tactics that are employed by neo-Nazi group targeting youth. Dr. Bethan Johnson is a scholar of violent extremism and terrorism in the modern West, based out of the University of Cambridge. In addition to her doctoral work on ethno-nationalist terrorism in the Cold War West, she conducts research into neo-Nazi and neo-fascist terrorism. Dr. Johnson is a doctoral fellow at the Center for Analysis of the Radical Right, where she heads the Political Violence and Terrorism Research Unit, and has written several articles about the financial, aesthetic, and rhetorical planning of the global radical right. She has also produced articles, reports, and briefing papers for governments and private corporations, and regularly consults on criminal proceedings related to the radical right. In 2019, Bethan was also awarded the Terrorism Research Award. Bethan, it is a pleasure to have you with us. We welcome your remarks.
Yes, thank you very much. So I'm going to attempt to share my screen here so that people can see some slides I've prepared. So hopefully this will work. So first I want to begin by thanking the organizers of this event for selecting what I really think is a genuinely very timely issue. As a practitioner and in the field and a researcher, I know firsthand that children and youth are falling prey to radicalized individuals with increasing frequency. And I strongly believe that we need to be asking ourselves a series of questions in order to combat this issue. But first, I want to begin my talk by illuminating just how real the threat is. And so earlier this month, actually, a 16-year-old Cornish boy stood before a judge and was sentenced on 12 counts of terrorism-related offenses, 2 of them for disseminating terrorist material. He faced judgment for actions that he had committed some 3 years prior, at the age of 13. He's actually the youngest person ever convicted of terrorist offenses in the UK. 13 is also the age of the alleged leader of one of the proscribed right-wing terrorist groups in the UK, Fear Creek Division. He was an Estonian boy, but he never faced charges for his role in leading this international terrorist neo-Nazi group, specifically because he was too young to face charges based off of Estonian law. Now, in some ways, the legal and logistical factors make it a challenge for us to know exactly how prevalent the problem of right-wing recruitment is in terms of children. But I've actually made a table that can help us understand to a certain extent how this is playing out in the UK, for instance. So in the last 5 years, we're seeing recruitment ages 16 and 17 in particular. But what we're actually seeing as well is that this is the age that they're coming into the criminal justice system in many cases, and they're being radicalized much sooner or earlier than that. So in their early teen to preteen ages. And our courtrooms are being filled with faces like these faces, which are just a couple here that we know of who've been publicly identified for their role in right-wing terrorist events or planned events. Young people, particularly boys, are standing trial for plots to kill other people, for disseminating terrorist materials, or encouraging violence. And often these youth are not just being convicted of these crimes, but pleading guilty and admitting that this is what they're doing. Now, obviously, in the case of neo-Nazism, white supremacism, and other right-wing extremist and terrorist groups, this isn't a new phenomenon. We wouldn't have had American History X if this was the first time, for instance, that we were dealing with the issue of youth radicalization. However, it is the case that the issue of proliferation and the popularity of terrorism among youth in the right-wing movement is growing in the last decade, and it's taking a toll on families, friends, and classmates more than ever before. And I'm aware of this because I'm asked constantly by the media if white boys are the next major threat to society, but also by family members and friends saying, like, how can I prevent my child from falling victim to radicalization? People are genuinely very worried about this. So there's a popular maxim that says that age is just a number. And in the realm of youth engagement with right-wing terrorism and extremism, this kind of proves both true and false. As one prosecutor said when discussing the case of the Cornish teen that I highlighted earlier, quote, the age is the alarming factor and his conduct betrays a maturity beyond his chronological age. While it is true that young people like those I've noted above stand accused of plotting some acts of serious brutality and profess and promote some of the most violent rhetoric online, it is also true that they are still children, that they are young people. They plan harm against others while also being victims of harm themselves. Their minds are being manipulated by others. And this isn't actually an error or something that's happening infrequently. It's actually seen as a very intentional thing. Young people are viewed as the new frontier of the radical right, and we have every reason to believe that that will only continue and actually worsen as a problem in the coming years. And this leads us to a series of questions that we should be asking ourselves about the phenomenon in order to combat it appropriately. The first one is, who are the actors involved, both in relation to the youth and the radicalizers? As noted in the previous slides, the young people in question are particularly young and increasingly getting younger. While several organizations claim that they will not admit anyone under the age of 16 to their groups, the reality is this just isn't the case. And that might be for a couple of different reasons. First, as will be discussed shortly, a great deal of radicalization is happening online, where it's very difficult to confirm someone's age. And so young people are joining, saying that they're over the age of 16, for instance, when they actually are much younger. I would also say that the other factor has to do with what's called sort of double talk, Groups will write that they don't admit young people or people under the age of 16 to their groups, that they don't promote violence or other things, whilst giving kind of coded winks and nudges that show that they really do those things. And aside from recruiting mostly from the younger age bracket, we also see a focus on recruiting boys, as I've noted. This also is the result of a series of factors, including the reality that most of the central thinkers of these groups and most of the radicalizers are themselves male, as well as the patriarchal belief that within extremist communities of various ilks, that men are superior and are better at engaging in violence. I also would argue that part of it has to do with the particular social pressures that young boys face in societies today that leave them vulnerable to a certain kind of isolation that leaves them, as again, also vulnerable to radicalization. And the factor of isolation is critical. Those being recruited are often showing signs of isolation and challenging home lives, as was just noted in the previous presentation. While not a rule, youth engaging with terrorism often experience turbulence in their home lives, challenges at school, difficulty with friends or finding romantic partners, or some combination of these three factors. Meanwhile, radicalizers are a relatively diverse set, with the exception of obvious demographic makeups of being white males. They're also often socially isolated. They're traditionally in their 20s and 30s, but this isn't always the case, as noted by the fact that the head of FKD, for instance, was 13. Another important factor to remember in all of this is that groups and individuals alike can radicalize a young person with like radical channels or pages on social media, passively providing young people with radical content that they internalize, as well as individuals seeking out children to groom for the purpose of radicalization. Usually the radicalization process combines both the active and the passive, though there's an increased emphasis on the passive in recent years as people are growing more concerned about law enforcement detection, and there's this push towards lone wolf terrorism. So then comes the issue of where is this happening? So where are the connections being made? As we noted, there's social media and online spaces are increasingly part of this. So while it is possible for young people to be recruited in the home, and this will likely become an increased issue in the next 10 to 15 years as radicalized people who've been radicalized in these new forms have children of their own, it is the case that many new recruits are being made not through face-to-face meetings, but through sort of the internet and other social media sites. And the various icons I've put up just are some of the common spaces for radicalization, and they go from the very mainstream Facebook, Twitter, things to more end-to-end encrypted channels and services, so WhatsApp all the way through to Discord and Telegram. And often what happens is, in the cases I've seen, people work their way up from the sort of more public-facing open sources to the more private settings. And briefly, it's worth talking about the world of gaming. I'm not a proponent of blaming gaming for all the social ills of the world, but it is also true that first-person shooter games in particular are popular as a site of radicalization. And there's a series of good logistical reasons for this. One of them is the idea that it perhaps desensitizes players to violence, which helps when recruiters are trying to encourage individuals to engage in violence themselves. However, the other element of it has to do with detection. So in these games, you often communicate via headset. And so if a radicalizer can engage with youth via headset, speak to them consistently, they aren't leaving a written record in the same way. Parents have less of knowledge of who their child is communicating with, and they can build friendships in this way. So radical recruiters do have the motivation and the means to speak to children, but what they have to do is they also have to present a compelling narrative, which leads to the what question. What are they saying and why is it working? What I would argue is that they've generated a really well-designed narrative aimed at targeting youth and young people in particular. What may appear at first glance to be incredibly off-putting language and imagery linked to violence and death is actually a carefully curated thing, striking a balance between the violent and kind of lulz cultures of the internet. Ideologically, the radical right is most often cellaring what's known as accelerationism. This is essentially the idea that liberal democracy is doomed to fail, and that violence can help accelerate this process along. Upon its collapse, white supremacist groups believe that ethnostates, fascist ethnostates, can emerge, and white people will either rule over all other races or be the exclusive race, having exterminated all non-white people. So accelerationism basically then encourages acts of lone wolf terrorism to accelerate this process, triggering race wars that lead to just all-out social disintegration. It's an incredibly dark theory and incredibly violent. It requires individuals to essentially sacrifice themselves in acts of terrorism to bring about mass death. And this is reflected in a great deal of the aesthetics on these sites. Given what they're asking to do, it in many ways seems like a surprise that it would appeal to young people in particular. But I would say, again, it's about how it's marketed to youth. For starters, despite the gravity of certain language, there's also an incredibly ironic sort of lulz culture, some could say humorous side to what they're doing. People joke about things like video games, they produce memes, they share humorous videos, they tell jokes. And this helps these sites feel like places, like communities, to make it appear like individuals are connecting and building real friendships. In which they can sort of laugh together as well as bemoan the struggles that they're having in life. That is one of the other essential elements to how these radical recruiters are getting children to join. They listen to them as they talk about feelings of isolation and hardship in their life, and how they feel adrift. Not only that, they then tell them that if they feel like a loner or a loser, it's not their fault, but rather society's fault. They're told that the current order makes them a loser and a loner, and if they can change that, then they can have a much better chance at a happy life. And so they then do what's fundamental, which is they give them a solution to the problem, which is to engage in violence themselves. Recruiters tell children who feel like they have no purpose with their life, that they have no value, or that they might be insignificant or unloved, that white supremacists do love them, that they do value them, and that they see them as contributing to the future in an essential way. Thus, white supremacist recruiters give youth the space to talk about their problems and then a supposed solution to them by telling them to join these terrorist groups. And so then comes the other essential question: why? Why do terrorist groups look at children? In theory, young people are much less capable of carrying out violent attacks than adults. They're also subject to greater scrutiny from law enforcement, parents, teachers, community workers, etc. It is therefore a risky business to radicalize youth. However, I would argue there's much to gain. First, if youth can go undetected for many years, they stand a chance of becoming incredibly radicalized when they reach adulthood, and having endured so many years of indoctrination, potentially being the most violent. They also have, in theory, the least to lose if they engage in violence, whereas adults might have children or romantic partners that they're afraid to leave behind should they die or be arrested in pursuit of a terrorist attack. Children don't have this in the same way, or young people may not have this. Young people also are struggling with issues of isolation and identity in particular. They need to feel like they fit in the world somehow, and they might not have the same level of support and have felt that way in the way adults may have. Finally, I would say it's also not as expensive or technologically difficult to engage in terrorism today than it was before, and young people are able to do that. So needing only access to a gun, which might be more easily accessible in certain countries than others, a car, a knife, or various household objects that can be used to build a bomb, youth can effectively become foot soldiers in white supremacist wars. So then the final question becomes, how do we address this issue? And I would say that it's a multi-pronged process that involves government, nonprofits, educators, and family and friends. There's all some role we can play. Obviously, governments need to pay close attention to terrorist groups, and they need to do more in the way of designating groups as terrorists so that they can take particular actions in terms of the legal system. There's a massive divide between the number of groups that are designated as terrorists in relation to Salafi jihadism and the radical right, and it has a major impact on how we deal with radicalization of youth. Governments, nonprofits, and educators also need to work together to show children that society benefits from diversity. People also need to be aware of the threat posed to youth online and be mindful of what their children and young people are looking at online. I'm not suggesting a kind of 1984 system, but knowing how young people are moving through the internet is incredibly important, and through gaming platforms as well. Also, on an interpersonal level, calling out conspiracy theories and hateful language is necessary to prevent beliefs sort of snowballing in a really dangerous manner. And all of this is particularly critical, I would argue, in this time of COVID, where essentially isolation is essential to physical health. Young people aren't feeling the benefits of society's diversity at present in the same way. So the home space is particularly critical in reminding them of this. There's no one silver bullet for combating white supremacist terrorism. However, we need to prevent the radicalization of youth if we want to have a brighter future. Thus, we need to be even more tactical than white supremacists, careful in our language as we show young people that their lives are worth living, that they're richer than they think they are, and that they're made so rich and exciting by the diverse society in which they live. And that's me. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bethan, for your invaluable insight and for articulating for our audiences the processes of socialization of youth in right-wing extremists. I am now delighted to introduce our next speaker, Henry Kopel. Henry is a federal prosecutor in Connecticut with over 30 years of experience investigating and prosecuting national security matters, domestic terrorism, violent crimes, narcotics trafficking, and white-collar crime. He is the author of the forthcoming book, War on Hate, How to Stop Genocide, Fight Terrorism, and Defend Freedom. Henry Kopel is also a graduate of Brandeis University, Oxford University, and the University of Pennsylvania Law School. He has served as a teaching assistant in the government department at Harvard College and lectured on prosecuting hate crimes at the University of Connecticut Law School. Henry, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Am I audible? Good. First, I want to thank Ms. Polizzi and her team for arranging this conference, and also to say what an honor it is to appear on this panel of distinguished researchers and scholars. Second, as a member of the Department of Justice, I'll specify that whatever views I say today are not the official views of the U.S. Department of Justice or the U.S. Attorney's Office in Connecticut, strictly those of my own research and thinking outside the parameters of the job. My focus jives very well with what we've already heard from Professor Simi and Professor Johnson. It's very interesting to see the overlay of the approach. Interestingly, I take this from a more theoretical approach because I've been very interested in the question of ideology and its role in the formation of characteristics and behaviors that we all seek to prevent. And that's the major subject of my book, is the ideological role in driving terrorism and genocides both. So I'll talk about four things briefly here that draw from that research I've been doing over the years. One, just the nature of terrorist ideologies. Two, why they matter. Three, why they especially matter vis-a-vis adolescents and young people. And lastly, similar to Professor Johnson, I want to suggest just a few ways we might think about countering and mitigating their adverse effects. So as to terrorist ideologies, there's been some tremendous research done by a lot of folks of all variety of terrorist groups, right-wing, left-wing, religious, secular, etc. What's really interesting is that they all find that the ideology these groups use is highly important in these groups' self-definition and very similar. Namely, all of these ideologies propagated by these groups among their recruits are what I would call extreme dualistic worldviews. Often this is called Manichaeism. Namely, you frame the world as divided between the forces of light and the forces of darkness. That's the dualism, or the oppressed versus the oppressor. The key to all these ideologies is the very extreme and simple us versus them framing. What they do, and this is where, as Professor Johnson said, they form a narrative and provide you with a whole worldview. They function as a call to hate and to mass murder those in the enemy, the out group. They leave no middle ground. Everyone is either with us or against us, either an ally or an existential enemy that must be vanquished and annihilated. Interestingly, as I look through the various tremendous amount of research done on this, turns out that this extreme dualism is characteristic of all types of terrorist ideologies, right-wing, left-wing, secular, and religious. Another interesting point that my research turned up that I talk about in the book is that the structure and the function of terrorist ideologies are virtually identical to the same characteristics of genocidal ideologies. And in fact, prior to either such event, you'll see this dualism. In either case, these ideologies push hatred and call for mass murder of the enemy group. And they do this by demonizing, dehumanizing, and scapegoating all of their in-group grievances against the out-group. As Professor Johnson said, it's not your fault, it's some other person's fault, and we gotta get them. So that being the case, why do these ideologies matter? One of the core sections of the book I write about is the fact that there's a great deal of what I would call circumstantial evidence that these ideologies are a central driver of both terrorist and genocidal violence. There's some debate over causation in the academic field, and so where I plant the flag from this research is ideologies are central. And so I'm going to summarize very briefly the evidence that my book catalogs. First, studies of both terrorist campaigns and genocides find that virtually always they are preceded by a lengthy and all-consuming deluge of these terrorist ideologies disseminated through propaganda, us versus them propaganda. And in fact, this happens especially and is done deliberately by the device of a closed media environment. Before genocides, it's very common for the group in power, the perpetrator group, to shut down contrary media, to shut down any other channels or platforms of communication that present counter narratives that sort of break the hold of these ideologies on the mass populace. And another interesting inference from that is leaders of genocidal campaigns and leaders of terrorist groups, by their actions, suggest that they believe these propaganda campaigns are a central tool in achieving their aims. And I would submit that there's other evidence that indicates that's true. One very interesting point that both studies of genocide perpetrators and terrorism perpetrators has found is that, contrary to some popular misconceptions, very few of them are psychopaths, very few of them are initially predisposed to violence, and very few of them are poor. There's a deep set of studies of the participants in terrorist acts, which finds that they tend to come from above average incomes and above average educations within their societies, especially true in overseas terrorist groups in developing countries. There's a great collection of these studies in the book by the late economics professor Alan Kruger of Princeton, What Makes a Terrorist. Just dozens of studies lead to this conclusion. And I'm going to quote Martha Crenshaw, one of the country's leading terrorist researchers, who concludes as follows: "The outstanding common feature of terrorists is their normality." And what that tells us is, and why that's significant, is that people are not born to be terrorists. They're made into terrorists by circumstances in their environment, whether it be the family, the society, etc. And in my book, I turn at this point to an abundance of social psychology experiments, because I've always been curious, why in the world does someone turn into the kind of person who can do these kind of horrible acts? And while no one is born a terrorist, it's also true that there are latent predispositions within all of us, latent or dormant predispositions towards extremism and violence. For most of us, thankfully, especially in a liberal society, they lay dormant and stay dormant throughout our lives. But these tendencies are very easily activated by terrorist hate propaganda, especially in the absence of a counter narrative. And I won't get into the details of these experiments. I'll just note the predispositions, but I'm sure a lot of folks listening here are familiar with them from social psych classes, et cetera. But about a half dozen of these predispositions that fit very closely with what people become when they become terrorists. Our capacity for in-group bias, a preference for and a higher regard for people of our own group, however we define it, as opposed to the out-group, is extraordinarily strong and not apparent unless one gets into these us versus them situations. Our tendency to conform to false beliefs when a majority surrounding us is articulating these false beliefs, again, is shockingly high, as demonstrated by social psychology experiments. Another set of experiments that have been wonderfully assembled, summarized by former presidential advisor Cass Sunstein, shows that there is a tremendous propensity of like-minded groups. When they go in a room to discuss the issue on which they already think alike, they will always come out more militant, more aggressive, and more extreme than when they went in. There is also, as we often hear, a low level of altruism in human nature towards strangers. And so when groups see someone else being treated badly, there's a surprisingly suppressed level of altruism and intervention in those situations, as demonstrated by a number of experiments. That relates to another thing that I was quite surprised to see, but there are experiments that show if a neutral observer happens to see someone treated in an unfair way, it's very common for our brains to say, well, they must have done something to bring that on themselves. They must have done something to deserve it. And you see this in the aftermath of a lot of violent events around the world. And it's non-empirical, but it's a powerful tendency. And then, of course, probably everybody in this setting has heard about the Stanley Milgram experiments, the shock learner experiments conducted in New Haven in the early 1960s. Just to quickly recap, Professor Milgram had the experimental subject be instructed as follows. You're going to read a series of word pairs to this person here who's going to try to learn the word pairs. The learner was actually an actor, but the subject didn't know that. And then you're going to quiz the learner on those word pairs. And every time they get a wrong answer, you're going to press this button and give them a little shock. And what's more, every time they get another one wrong, you're going to raise the shock level and go all the way up the shock board up to 300 volts. Milgram, of course, was wondering how could people have done what they did in the Holocaust in similar situations. And he designed this experiment to try to plumb that question. At Yale, the psychology faculty was interviewed and said, how do you think this experiment's going to go? And they all said, well, almost nobody's going to get halfway up the scale, and no 1 in 10,000 will get all the way up the scale. They were quite wrong. A majority of people went beyond halfway up the scale when the learner is acting, mind you, screaming in pain and agony, let me go, I can't do this, this is horrible, all the way up to the scale to when the learner collapses and looks like they've had a heart attack. So the Milgram experiments are controversial, but they've been replicated at least 30 times around the world. Our capacity to inflict pain on subordinate strangers is very high. I would say that these social psychology insights are corroborated by a lot of real world experience. By the way, one point I bring out in the book is that these experiments usually involve just a few minutes or a half hour of an exposure to the activating circumstance. In a mass hate campaign, we're talking about years, 24/7, in the absence of counter narratives, just drilled into the society. That's how it was in Nazi Germany. It's how it was in Serbia before the genocide of the Bosnians. That's how it is in communities that are giving rise to terrorists. So this stuff is powerful. And when you look at places in the world where the high degree of hate indoctrination is coursing through the various media platforms, you do see a direct correlation in the levels of terrorist activity, as I drew from the University of Maryland START terrorism database, and the corroborations are quite strong. Having said all this, what does this have to do with children and recruitment? Well, I sort of go back to what our other distinguished speakers have said. These terrorist ideologies, these narratives, they're not something that if you become a terrorist, it's like a 9-to-5 job. I show up, I do my thing, and then 5 o'clock I go home and deal with my family and my hobbies and watch TV. No, terrorists are in a all-encompassing world framed by this narrative. I'll give you one example. I had the responsibility of prosecuting a bunch of white supremacists in Connecticut about 10 years ago. They were called the Connecticut White Wolves. They were trying to sell firearms and explosive devices to a larger Klan group outside the state. They didn't know that they were talking to an FBI informant wearing an audio wire. It was a fascinating case. When we finished the investigation, long before the trial, and everybody was arrested, was 5 people. We got warrants to search their homes. And I'm sure Professor Simi has seen this time and time again in the field work. When they went into the home of the leader of the group, a modest apartment, It was a shrine to white supremacism and a shrine to Nazism. They had, I didn't know they made them this big, 10-foot wall-sized posters of Hitler, 10-foot wall-sized posters of the Schutzstaffel, the SS guards from the concentration camp. And even the little details, the refrigerator, we have refrigerator magnets of a city we visited or a favorite sports team. They have all the white supremacist code words. 88, because H is the 8th letter of the alphabet. So 88 means HH for Heil Hitler. That was all over the refrigerator and the walls. It just goes on and on. So what I'm saying is terrorist ideologies play a major role in identity formation. And as Professor Johnson just said, adolescents are especially in the vulnerable, pliable phase when they're still putting together who they are, how they fit with the world, and what their identity is. These ideologies are especially toxic to people whose identities have not yet fully formed. So this stuff is really problematic. I'm going to just say a few things about how we might respond and try to mitigate the effects of these ideologies. Once again, my research is all secondary. I just went out and looked at what does everybody have to say about this? What are some of the best suggestions? I tried to pull some of them together. Just like Professor Johnson said, there's no one magic bullet. You got to hit it on all levels. I believe first, it's really important and very doable to map and name and shame. With big data analytics and the online environment is very problematic, but it also gives us resource and information. We should be doing that both domestically as well as internationally. It's not just the jihad groups, it's these supremacist groups and terrorist groups within our borders we've got to keep an eye on. Counter-propaganda is very important, both in the negating sense and the positive alternative sense. As you've heard, these terrorist ideologies are most successfully proliferated in the absence of a counter-narrative. We need to bring, as best we can, counter-narratives into the situation. I suspect there would be some consensus on the panel that those best equipped to do that, with the standing and the audience that they can affect, are former terrorists, former extremists who have found a better way and know the groups, know the language, know the code words, and have the status in the eyes of their audience to say, look, there's a better way to do this. Another thing about counter narratives, it's important to point out to these groups, what you're seeking to do, it's not going to get you what you want. You can talk till the cows come home about preserving the race and this and that, but it's really not going to solve the problems that you've loaded into this bankrupt ideology. And that's where positive narratives come in. Now, I think as our other panelists pointed out, these identities tend to be formed early in the family. They tend to put them on the path and they get very path dependent. But the second best shot where we can impact things is in the schools and in education, because it may not be as effective as we wish, but we got to start somewhere. I believe that if done right, education for pluralism and for diversity and mutual respect can be very effective. I don't know the best ways to do it, but it certainly can play a role. And one account that I think verifies that, there's a psychologist named Eva Fogelman, and her life pursuit was, why in the world did some people during the Nazi Holocaust, some Germans who'd been absolutely smothered in this propaganda, nonetheless rescue, hide, and save their Jewish neighbors at the risk of their own lives and their families' lives? Extraordinary acts, these Holocaust rescuers. Here's what Fogelman found. She said from her lengthy interviews of several of these people, this was the common factor. And I'm going to look at my notes here because it's a direct quote. These rescuers grew up in tolerant families who accepted people from all walks of life. As children, they were taught by parents that all human beings are created in the image of God. My takeaway from this is an inbred mindset of intercultural tolerance can function as a psychological vaccine against hate indoctrination. Or as the late British Rabbi Jonathan Sacks, who just passed away, used to say, tomorrow's world is born in what we teach our children today. I'd lastly say that where possible, and I know folks are doubtless aware of this, and I say do this with caution as someone who believes in the importance and vitality of the First Amendment and American jurisprudence, we can work with online platforms which do have hate monitors and do try to shut down accounts that are spreading unmitigated hatred. Civil litigation is sometimes possible, at least when you can tie the incitement to specific acts. In America, we can't prosecute speech, but we can prosecute the products of the speech. There was a horrible lynching some years ago by a Ku Klux Klan group down south, and the mother and family of the victim of that crime sued the Ku Klux Klan because of their organization and incitement. and they won in civil court, and they bankrupted the Ku Klux Klan as a result. That was a great victory. And lastly, there's criminal investigation and prosecution. The American civil rights laws do include provisions when speech causes bad conduct, that hate is the driver of conduct, we can prosecute. There's the interstate riot statute, 18 U.S. Code 2101, where you can prosecute folks for the interstate acts in support of starting a riot, which is violence by 3 or more people against persons or properties. And I'll close on one last thought. It's been said by some that culture is paramount in these spaces, or as they say, politics is downstream from culture. I happen to believe that. And although I have no idea how we can get this to change, I think it's good for us to all be mindful. The more our opinion leaders and our political leaders model a less dualistic, a less us versus them approach to public discourse, the better we'll all be. And there's a lot of work to do. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Henry, for your precious observation on propaganda and the impact of hate incitement on terrorism, violence, for offering your recommendation and also for reminding us the importance of education. It is with great pleasure now that I introduce our last speaker, Daryl Johnson. Daryl Johnson is one of the foremost experts on domestic terrorism in the United States. Beginning his career as a civilian in the US Army, Johnson has held several government positions, most recently as a senior analyst at the Department of Homeland Security. He is the owner of DT Analytics, a private consulting firm for law enforcement, academia, and other organizations. In 2020, Daryl was invited to serve as an honorary member of We Are Many, United Against Hate in Madison, Wisconsin. He also accepted the position of non-resident fellow at the Center for Global Policy in Washington, D.C. Daryl is regularly cited, featured, and quoted in the media, including in the New York Times, Washington Post, Wall Street Journal, Newsweek, National Public Radio, MSNBC, CNN, and NBC Nightly News, among many others at home and abroad. He is also the author of Heighten, a long, hard look at America's extremist heart and the right-wing resurgence, how a domestic terrorism threat is being ignored. Daryl is also a freelance writer for various media and civil rights organizations. In 2012, he testified before the Senate Judiciary Committee on Hate Crimes and the Threat of Domestic Extremism. Thank you very much, Daryl. I really appreciate your attendance today.
Thank you. First off, I just want to thank our other panelists, and I learned a lot, and I echo everything that they've said. And in fact, Henry, ideology is at the heart of motivation for terrorism. So your point about how important propaganda and ideology is has a lot of truth to it. A couple of things I just want to close out with, and in the interest of time, I don't want to take too long, but I think it's important for us to kind of understand the landscape of domestic terrorism here in the United States, particularly on the far right, since they're so active right now, why this issue continues to be of utmost importance to the nation. And then I'll close out with some resources and recommendations that I personally have. So when I did a query earlier today on extremist recruitment of youth, there's a lot of material out there, and overwhelmingly it's focused on radicalization of children in foreign countries in particular. But there was quite a bit on white supremacist radicalization of youth as well. So there's plenty of material to draw upon, to learn about, and people's life experiences to read about. But also we need to be mindful that there are other far right groups that do recruit children. The Kenosha shooting last year, we had a 17 or 18-year-old boy kill 2 people and shoot another at a protest in Wisconsin. He was not a white supremacist. Okay, he was an anti-government militia supporter. So we need to understand that there's other far right groups here in America that also recruit youth, and we shouldn't exclude them at the expense of one movement over the other. So, in addition to the white supremacy movement, which has a variety of sub-movements under it, like KKK factions, neo-Nazi, racist skinheads, all these things that have been mentioned, we also have an anti-government side of right-wing extremism, which includes paramilitary groups like militias, as well as sovereign citizen groups that don't believe in paying taxes or government regulation and laws, things of this nature. And then there's some single issue extremist groups on the far right, like violent anti-abortion extremists, violent tax resistors. We also have this violent white male supremacy movement. Some people refer to these guys as incels or involuntary celibates. I would say that, of all these groups, this white supremacy and the male supremacy movements probably target the youth the most. In my 25 years of being in the intelligence and law enforcement analytical capacity, I've seen how the tactics of recruiting youth have changed over the years. Back when I first started doing this, they had comic books that they would market to young kids that had racial themes and propaganda inside of the comic book storylines. We also had, stickers and, pamphlets being distributed at schools. We had some white supremacist groups that actually had children programs that they had instituted. And so when they set up a website, they would have a children's section, coloring books. And then it started, later in the 90s, we started seeing the music scene starting to market to the youth. Hate rock, CDs, music CDs, bands, having concerts in different locations, inviting these disenfranchised, vulnerable youth to participate in these concerts held at local venues. And then with the advent of gaming, we saw, neo-Nazis adapting first-person shooter games here in the United States to have racial themes to them. We had video games like Zog's Nightmare, which stands for Zionist Occupied Government Nightmare. Ethnic Cleansing was another first-person shooter game that was developed and modified by white supremacists to target the youth. So they changed all of the targets in the video game, rather than being aliens or some foreign military force that you're fighting. These were blacks, or Mexicans or Jews, and that's what you were shooting in these games. And so I would say, just like the previous panelists have said, online gaming is probably one of the biggest ways that they recruit, as well as live streaming, YouTube channels, as well as the social media sites, including Pinterest, and Instagram and things like that. So it's important for us to understand that this is a multifaceted extremist threat, and it's not going to be going away anytime soon. Many people here in the United States have the false notion that the January 6th insurrection at the U.S. Capitol was somehow the crescendo, the end of this right-wing extremism that we've been seeing, this buildup for the past 10, 11 years. No, it's not. I'll tell you that this is ushering in a new era of violent white supremacist, anti-government, far-right extremism. And the reason why I say that is because in the lead up to the Oklahoma City bombing, which was up until 9/11, the deadliest terrorist attack that we've had here in America that was actually perpetrated by an anti-government extremist, there was only a 3-year incubation period for these movements. This time around, leading up to the Capitol insurrection, we've had over 10 years of recruiting, radicalizing, terrorist attacks, plotting. And the fact that we have an incoming Democratic administration, this is when these groups tend to thrive the most. We saw it under the Clinton administration and the results that happened there. And the reason is because many of these far-right groups, like the previous panelists have said, are involved in, they fear gun legislation or gun bans. They fear immigration policies being laxed under Democrats. They fear ethnic minorities' status and rights being expanded under Democratic administrations. So at the very least, we have 4 years of growth and heightened risk involving these right-wing extremists. And I predict it could go as long as another decade. So it's important for us to recognize that this isn't going away. It's gotten worse and it's going to get worse. And so that's why it's so important now to focus on, the youth, getting them to dismiss these belief systems, these conspiracy theories that lead them into group activity and indoctrination. Because today's youth is tomorrow's terrorist. And so we got to start at that problem set to be able to mitigate future activity. Just to name off a few of the violent attacks that we've had carried out here in plotting, just recently, I mentioned the Kenosha shooting up in Wisconsin. Just this past year, we had a young lady in Virginia who plotted to firebomb a bunch of Black churches, basically a white supremacist female teenager. We had a male in Virginia, Southern Virginia, incel member that had a bomb blow up in his face. He was building bombs to kill cheerleaders at his high school. In 2019, we had or 2017, I think it was the Parkland shooting, the mass shooting at the school in Florida. This suspect had Nazi swastikas and other types of things on the assault rifle that he used in that shooting. We had another school shooting targeting Latinos in New Mexico, where the high school students subscribed to neo-Nazi type beliefs. We can go all the way back to the Columbine shooting. One of the very first mass shootings here in America, those two suspects also idolized Hitler and embraced neo-Nazi types of beliefs. And yet, the media and our government and political leaders all dismiss these types of attacks as, school shootings or, an insane gunman or a hate crime or something like that, where actually there was belief systems that motivated these people towards violence. I'm going to close out with a couple of things as far as recommendations. I want to highlight several programs that I think are really cutting edge and can be beneficial to school systems as well as communities here in the United States that are already established. They just need to be utilized and expanded. The Western State Center has put out a pamphlet or a brochure about white nationalism, recruitment of youth. They lay out a bunch of scenarios and how parents, school officials, teachers, as well as counselors and principals, how they should deal with these different scenarios in the school environment. Anything from, someone subscribing or writing down a swastika on their notebook to, racial intimidation to school shooting plots, what have you. So I highly recommend them as a resource. I'm also going to recommend the Anti-Defamation League, which has a lot of resources and an educational program that you can look over on their website. There's also a group called Not in Our Town that has a school program called Not in Our School. And they're talking about not only anti-bullying, but anti-hate and anti-extremism. The last organization that I'll endorse is the one that I just volunteered to be on the honorary board member, and that is We Are Many United Against Hate. Just last year, they rolled out a program in our schools to basically have children serve as ambassadors to the organization and form clubs and chapters in their high schools to talk about these issues, racism, misogyny, sexism, all kinds of things that kind of lead in and feed into extremism. And so, if we roll out these programs nationally and if all the schools incorporate an anti-hate component to their anti-bullying program or their anti-gang program, I think we will be doing a great service to the youth of the country, and we will mitigate a lot of tomorrow's violent offenders. As far as the age group we're talking, as far as extremist recruiting here in the United States, I read articles that children as young as 9 years old have been targeted on, an online gaming system by white supremacists. I think the most vulnerable age we're seeing are the young teens that are in middle school. And I think one of the biggest reasons for that is because a lot of these children may have gone to an all white or predominantly white elementary school, but middle school is truly where they're first introduced because you've got many elementary schools feeding into the middle school and to the high school even, where they start seeing Muslims in the classroom or blacks or having more than just one or two black kids in my school. They're introduced to a lot more diversity when they get into middle school and high school. And so increasingly, the white young boys may start, experiencing some alienation. And also, going back to the point about misogyny and failure to find partners and stuff, it's in middle school and high school where people start first forming kind of these romantic relationships. And so they may face rejection for the first time, not getting, a person that they want to go out with or date might not accept that. And so those are the kids I think that really need the focus and emphasis is when they get into middle school and high school. And of course, we can't forget about the college campuses as well. We've seen extremist propaganda efforts skyrocket at college campuses across the country just in the past few years. And you can go to the ADL and other places to get some of the statistics on that. So that's kind of my message for today. So we'll go ahead and turn it back over and we'll get into some questions and answers.
Thank you very much, Daryl. In the last 20 minutes, I would like, in fact, to open the floor for question and answer. I would like to start now by addressing the first question to both Pete and Bethan. Right-wing populist political embrace of supremacist ideology has aided neo-Nazi and the related recruitment of youth. And we know that such recruitment occurs through popular culture, as it was mentioned during this discussion, as well as through the support of new technologies that have in fact expanded the recruitment capacities of right-wing extremists. And the question for you is, what are the exit options for youth? And how is it possible to promote youth disengagement from violent and right-wing groups? And lastly, how effective these strategies are when parents, caregivers, or peers are at the same time the primary points of reference in a child's social ecology, and also the agents passing on a set of extremist beliefs on their children.
Yeah. So I would say, in the U.S., I work closely with an organization, Life After Hate, which was founded by former white supremacists to do interventions with individuals. And actually, increasingly over the last couple of years, about 50% of their clients are now family and friends. That is a person who has a loved one or someone that they care deeply about, who they're concerned is radicalizing towards white supremacist extremism. And so they're, increasingly working with these, populations in terms of the families and friends, as well as the individuals directly. And certainly Europe has a much longer history of exit programs like Life After Hate. So in the US, most of our interventions in terms of this are more in terms of the conventional gang population. And the US has really not invested much resources until just recently at trying to develop programs like Life After Hate in this respect that would help kind of counter right-wing extremist radicalization. So we don't know a lot about effectiveness in terms of evaluation. We're still learning a lot in terms of what approaches are best fits. Life After Hate has a very specific approach and model that's based on a more general kind of social work case management approach. They've adopted the kind of professional standards from the American Association of Social Work. And a lot of their approach is informed by kind of trauma informed care, as well as motivational interviewing. So a very non-judgmental kind of empathetic approach. And that for the family and friends that they work with, a lot of the guidance is in terms of trying to help them, interact with and have discussions with the person they're concerned about in a way that's not going to push them further, because that's one of the things that does happen in some cases, is that if you're concerned about someone and you have a conversation with them in a very kind of combative way or judgmental way, that can actually push them further into the extremism. So they work with these clients that are families and friends in a way that that try to kind of coach them in that respect. But I mean, the point of the question too is that, you know, the family and friends that are approaching life after hate are folks that do not have, you know, aren't sympathetic to the extremist ideology of right-wing extremism. And so there is certainly a population of folks who are not going to approach life after hate because they have some underlying views that are at least somewhat consistent with a person in their family who's radicalizing. And that situation is obviously very difficult, although I think a lot of, you know, the previous speakers to focus on schools, I think is super important, because schools have an opportunity to impact kids. Even if their families are somewhat sympathetic or supportive, they can potentially try and offset some of that through their contact with children.
Thank you very much, Pete. Bethan, please.
Yes, I think that there are a few things I wanted to note. First off, I would say when I speak to people who have these questions about, I think maybe my child, my grandchild, or a friend might be showing signs of radicalization, I think it's important to note, if you feel in any way endangered yourself, as Peter noted, you don't need to do this intervention on your own. If you feel concerned that you're going to push someone further by the conversations that you're having, or you feel threatened by doing so, you should not do that. You should take care of yourself as well. Alert someone, be it a member of the community, reach out to any of these organizations, or speak to law enforcement. Also, particularly if you think there is a kind of imminent threat going on, that if you're really noting something very serious, it's not necessarily the case that your first port of call is yourself, but sometimes does need to be someone further along in the process, like law enforcement, if you're really detecting something. And I think that's important to note, because sometimes, especially with family, people feel guilty about potentially noting if their loved one is displaying these risk factors or these red flags. But it is important to note that that is an option as well. I think there are lots of avenues in terms of speaking with people or noticing how to get out. I work more in the other side of things. So as individuals radicalize, as opposed to come down off of the other side of the mountain, as it were. So I would encourage people to look online and to speak through that. I think as Henry noted, that there is a extreme benefit to having a part of that component be individuals who have de-radicalized themselves, be part of that narrative to help show individuals that there is a life after, and that life can be quite fruitful. And also that if they've done anything, that they can, or like promoted any violence, engaged in violence, that they don't need to feel stuck because they've already done something wrong and they can't get out now because it's too late, that they can live a fruitful and contributive life to mainstream society after getting out as well. I think that's important to tell young people. And I think the other thing to note, aside from teachers, is also religious leaders and other community groups. Peter was noting educators in terms of individuals who are noting like youth radicalization and think maybe that the parents or caretakers are part of that or contributing to that radicalization process. I would also say if you're a religious leader or a community leader in the US, for instance, like a Boy Scout or a Girl Scout troop member, if you're noticing that as being something that's happening with someone, a youth that you are working with, trying to figure out safe ways to talk to them, but also just demonstrate to them on a daily basis that there is an alternative way to engage with people who are different from themselves. Leading by example is something that we don't talk enough about, but is really helpful for young people because they are mimicking, yes, their parents or whoever is their caregiver, but also they're also mimicking other people around them, particularly in instances in which they're also experiencing abuse in the home. They're aware that there is a different way to live potentially, and they don't necessarily always trust their parents, even if that's who is taking care of them. So providing them with good examples outside the home is really critical, I would argue.
Thank you very much, Bethan. There is a question for Daryl. Daryl, since the growth of terrorist movements and organizations in the Middle East during the 80s and the 90s, followed by the 9/11 attack, the term terrorism has become synonymous with Islamic radicalism. At the same time, other types of violent extremism have been relatively neglected. Right-wing extremists were in fact in recent years responsible for more fatalities in violent attacks in the United States than any other type of extremism. Would you agree that the pervasive focus on violent jihadis has until now obscured the large number of terrorist plots initiated or carried out by US right-wing extremists? And if yes, what tools are at our avail to tame the latent or the actual potential of these groups, recruiting the young generation and continuing to pose a threat in the short and the long term to national security?
Yeah, so I think, because of the US government's over focus on terrorism from the Middle East, it came at an expense. And if anyone knows the history of my career, I found myself at the center of a heated political controversy in 2009 when I wrote a controversial intelligence assessment warning of the rise and shift of right-wing extremism here in the United States. And basically it got caught up in, political mudslinging, conservatives objecting to the term right-wing extremism, objecting to the fact that I point out returning military veterans were vulnerable to recruitment, the fact that we had a vague definition buried in a footnote that kind of painted a broad brush of the types of extremists and issues that extremists on the far right are motivated by. And so, yes, it sent a chilling effect. And, the US government, for good reasons after 9/11, had an overwhelming focus on Al-Qaeda and other terrorist groups from overseas. But I would argue that, each year after we got removed from 9/11 and no other mass casualty producing attack occurred, there should have been a more balancing of resources, particularly at the federal level, and that we should let the threat dictate the resources and money rather than, a political agenda. So that answers the first part of your question. As far as tools that we have, the federal government right now is getting its act together, I would say. The new administration has mentioned this as a top priority for them. They've asked the intelligence and federal law enforcement community to produce an exhaustive threat assessment for the country, which I think is a good first step. We need to have a conference bringing academics, private industry experts, as well as government experts together to brainstorm strategies and ideas that would be most effective. We have legislation proposed on the Hill. The one that I support the most is Dick Durbin's 2021 Domestic Terrorism Prevention Act, which just delineates roles and responsibilities among federal agencies to get rid of this jurisdictional turf battles and infighting that goes on. But there also needs to be programs, like I mentioned, programs in our schools developed. There needs to be a national training program for our state and local law enforcement to be trained on these various extremist movements, their beliefs and tactics and capabilities. There needs to be more community engagement. Individual family members need to get involved if they have family, close friends, co-workers that are embracing any of these types of extremist beliefs. And going back to the question about exit programs, I echo what Pete Simi and Christian Picciolini know, and that is we're not going to get anywhere debating beliefs or trying to convince somebody that their belief system is wrong or hateful or what have you. It's going to be through love and compassion that these people are going to renounce these beliefs, reacclimating them back into our families and back into our communities, back into society, making them productive people, teaching them that, other races are capable of loving your race and vice versa. Just giving them real world examples. One thing I will say when it comes to exit strategies, you don't want to debate these types of things with these people. They're going to get entrenched, they're going to get defensive, and it's not going to lead anywhere. You also don't want to penalize the people too much if they're not committing crimes or violence or threats. We had a case in Northern Virginia of a neo-Nazi teen when the parents found out that their daughter was dating this neo-Nazi teen. They tried to intervene and used a punitive approach. No contact. This person's not allowed around our house. You're not going to, talk to this guy ever again. And he ended up breaking into the home and murdering the mother and father. So it ended up with a double homicide. We don't want that. So it's very important when parents and teachers and others do attempt to exit intervention that it's done from a point of active listening, love, compassion, and kind of trying to show this person that there's other choices besides joining a hate group.
Thank you very much, Daryl. A question for Henry and Daryl, if you want to comment on this as well afterwards. At the tip of the iceberg of the agent of extremism and violence may be found political parties, social movements, and violent organizations. But we know that violent extremism affects the very infrastructural levels of society in which high degrees of intolerance, ethnocentrism, xenophobia, racism, and other radical views may also be found and serve in fact as a reservoir of resources, either electoral or moral or even organizational for the agents of extremism. Do you believe that past failures to openly condemn right-wing's extremist violence and clearly defining it as terrorism has in fact legitimized these groups and perhaps also increased the involvement of individuals with no previous ties to extreme right-wing's environments?
Thank you, Cecilia. With the caveat that the politics of the situation is outside my research field, but obviously we all think about these issues and care about these issues. I'd be curious what all members of the panel think. I do think that it's important always to make clear that there are certain things that folks who seek a good pluralistic society just don't accept, that there comes a point where tolerance for intolerance can eat up the tolerant of a society. And so we have to draw those lines. People use the phrase dog whistles and winking at these groups while they promote their ideologies. Not a good idea. As to how much public failures to denounce the groups affect their proliferation, I don't know the answer to that. I think these groups proliferate for a lot of reasons, and I think that's a really important area that we probably need more study and research. It seems that they tend to go in cycles, and they tend to quiet down, and then they tend to come back. The terrorism evidence is that most terrorists are not people who are poor and desperate. Those folks are too busy trying to survive to engage politically. But I do feel when there is social dislocation, that these things tend to proliferate. One of the interesting books I read recently that I incorporated in my own writing was law professor Amy Chua at Yale Law School, a book called World on Fire. And what that book talks about is one of the reasons ethnic violence tends to get worse is when there are changes in the economic structure of society, when one or more groups seem to be thriving and other groups seem to be falling behind, or they perceive that they're falling behind. Those are the times when you tend to get a lot of ethnic rivalry. Why? Even if there's not a ground up tendency to extremism in the group that's falling behind, the easiest way to win political power in that situation from the group that's declining relatively is to blame the group that's getting ahead. Scapegoating. It's a very powerful and common political mechanism. And so sometimes the rise of ethnic tension tends to be top down rather than bottom up by people who are trying to win power based on scapegoating. So that's always a red flag. And so I think times of radical economic change and dislocation, which is inevitable in a evolving economy, I think we have to be really mindful of how different groups are affected differentially and try to make sure that everybody's getting a piece of the pie.
So I went on the record back in 2011 when I went public with my story about what happened with the 2009 assessment that I wrote that got leaked and created this political firestorm. I went on the record and said that I'm a third generation Republican, registered Republican, and that I was a very conservative Mormon at the time when I wrote that report. So there was no political agenda pointing out a threat from within my community, so to speak, my political social community. So it's going to take Republican leadership to denounce this threat and to take action against it. If the Democrats are the sole people taking action against this threat, then it's just going to feed into the extremist narratives that the Democrats are evil. They're out to get us. They're going to, take our rights away. And so I'm calling out in the public, in the news, Republican leaders to denounce this threat, to call it terrorism when it's ideologically motivated violence, and to stop sidestepping the issue. And one other last point I'll make, this previous administration that we had, I feel really poured gasoline onto a fire that was already burning quite large with the Obama presidency. And they did nothing to mitigate it or to denounce it. They just inflamed it. And this is actually the first time in the 40 years that I've been looking at this, going all the way back to when I was a young teen, I became interested in this topic. This is the first time I've seen these white supremacist and anti-government groups thrive under a Republican administration. So that tells you something. The previous Republican administrations, they didn't tweet about how these are good, noble, special people. They didn't say you need to start liberating these states when people were having, anti-lockdown protests and or Second Amendment right protests as well. When Charlottesville happened, when the Kenosha shooting happened, when other violence has happened, they turned a blind eye, dismissed it, even pandered them, sending them little winks and nods through Twitter messages. So I do believe that played a role in the threat to continue to thrive, at least for the past 4 years, where under Republican-led administration, typically they decrease their activities.
Thank you very much, Daryl. Yes, Pete, please.
I was just going to say that, a big part of understanding terrorism is perceptual. So I just want to go back to points that Daryl raised about the 90s. So we had the Oklahoma City bombing in 95. Daryl also mentioned Columbine, which was 99. Shortly after Columbine in the summer of 99, you had two major terror attacks, shooting rampages, one in Southern California, one in multiple states in the Midwest. Between Oklahoma City and Columbine, just a year after Oklahoma City, you had the 96 Summer Olympics attack in Atlanta. And then in 98, you had the murder of James Byrd Jr., drugged to death, behind, tied to the back of a pickup truck, drugged to death, beheaded. He was decapitated. So we had a beheading in 1998. It was, certainly motivated by racial animus. So we had a clear wave of terror from 95 to 99 that we did not perceive as such. And so I think a lot of what Henry discussed really provides answers to why that is. And these, when you have an insider threat, it's so oftentimes hard to perceive. So now we're in a moment that it looks like is getting more attention, but I'm very skeptical and I'm very concerned that there's still going to be a larger perceptual problem that's not going to adequately address the problem the way it needs to be addressed.
Thank you very much, Pete. Yes, Bethan.
I would also say that the other part to this story, when we think about how political leaders of various ilks can do things, it doesn't necessarily always have to come with like very direct things. So I remember when discussions were having with regards to Barack Obama and his campaign, that he wasn't born in the United States. And was he secretly, because one of his middle name and all of these other things which people entertained as a concept because there was an electability factor to it, or there was some kind of utility to that kind of thing. And in many cases, people don't necessarily always think of that as being overtly racist. Some people would say like, oh, well, we just wanted to check, or any number of other things. But that certainly contributed in many ways to that factor. And so emphasis on things like that has been longer standing than I think often people give it credit for. That's a conversation that the US has been having for quite some time. And it can be, obviously in the United States, there's a huge emphasis on free speech and people are able to say what they want. I think the important part, or the antidote to that in some way, is also individuals being willing on the other side to stand up and say, you have every right to say that, however, it's incorrect. And this is what there need to be ramifications for this kind of speech in a sort of social capacity that hasn't necessarily happened. And we need that from political leaders of every ilk. And I think you also need that in your interpersonal life. But I think there's often, in my opinion, a conflation between the idea of free speech and consequence-free speech that are not the same thing. But because of cautions about wanting to be, or not wanting to be perceived as limiting speech, we don't call out what we should. And it allows these communities to normalize certain behaviors or certain arguments. To the point where young people and everyone think that those aren't racist or aren't problematic ideas, and all of a sudden you're much farther along the radicalization process than you think. So for me, I've always been an advocate of saying, while you can be a free speech advocate, consequence-free speech is not the same thing, and we need to create a better accountability system in society for those kinds of things to stop this radicalization.
Thank you very much, Bethan. I'm afraid we have exhausted the time that we had at our avail for this session, and so I would like to thank our speakers very much for participating to this live briefing, and also to our audiences for joining us today. Goodbye, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.